This is the recording of a practice read-through of a presentation that I gave at the Britain and the World Conference in 2024. I presented on June 21st, so I'm just going to do my little presentation. This is a presentation of the paper that I gave at the Britain and the World Conference 2024 in Winchester, United Kingdom. The Welsh meaning behind the British Empire. Throughout the 16th century, the Tudor regime had carefully curated a version of British historical narrative to support its claims to legitimate authority. During crises of legitimacy, such as the Reformation, this British narrative served as a remedy. It seeped into the public's expected understanding of how 16th century England fit within its own historical context. At the end of the last Tudor's reign, the past influenced how England imagined its position in the world. Henry VII's claims of restoring ancient Britannia and his son's assertion that England was an empire would both go one step further under his granddaughter, Elizabeth I. Britain would expand into a territorial British Empire during her rule. The idea of what a British Empire meant to the 16th century mind was different from what it would come to mean in the 17th. Indeed, British in the context of this talk refers to the people self-identifying as British, the Welsh to our contemporary understanding, as stark a difference as 16th century understanding of what Anglo-Saxones meant for our contemporary usage, a past far less Anglo-centric than our common understanding of history today. The union of Scotland and England under a single crowned head established a legalized meaning of Great Britain. The idea of Tudor Britain created a continuity from pre-Roman times to the crowning of Henry after Bosworth, who had fulfilled the prophecies of Merlin, Cadwallader, and even Henry VI. The image was of Britannia restored. The Welsh-descended scholar, John Dee, is an example of the perfect candidate for Tudor state legitimation efforts. Advisor to Elizabeth I, magician, mathematician, navigator, and antiquary, Dee embodies the Tudor synthesis of ancient Britain with 16th century England. While Dee's character and career are fascinating in their own right, his importance to my argument lies in his efforts to justify the Kingdom of England's expansion into North America, an extension of the Tudor legitimacy discourse outward from England, and in his creation of the concept of a British Empire, albeit one with a stark difference from our modern understanding. Dee lays out his knowledge of the relationship between Tudor state and ancient Britain in his treatise on navigation, General and Rare Memorials. To begin with, he refers to the rulers of the Kingdom of England as the British monarchy. It was common for Welsh scholars to refer to the Tudor dynasty as inheritors of an ancient British kingdom, so it is easy to understand why Dee would include it. Dee expands this royal connection to describe British monarchy as an imperial one that ruled over a British Albion, and could claim inheritance from ancient Arthur's empire. From this, Dee introduces the concept of a British Empire now restored. Used in this way, Dee's is one of the first instances of the British Empire being used in an expansionist context. However, it would be a mistake to view this principally as a forward-looking harbinger of a global and British imperialism that ensued over the past 400 years. Instead, Dee's British Empire was the culmination of Tudor historical arguments developed over the previous decades, ones based on imperium, that is, empire in the sense of dominion over more than a single nation. Dee subtly modifies this meaning and gestures toward the empire of the future, though one he could hardly have imagined, by extending the imperium of the Tudors to the Americas. He eliminates any doubt that he is writing for future audiences. He clearly states for whom the empire was for. Elizabeth will bring forth commonwealth, invincible strength, and immortal triumphant fame. Three most loyal British children, and long wished for, of the true British and Christian Druids, they being also political philosophers and not sophisticate. He argues that the empire was made for the British. Even more emphatically, he links to the ancient British past with the evocation of the Druids. Dee's argument about empire is one of restoration for the betterment of the British. There is enough from this idea of British to include the English, however, Dee does not explicitly include them. The historical argument of the Tudors trace their legitimate authority through the line of Brutus and the mythic King Arthur, following the Roman occupation. Dee was a proud celebrant of such arguments and used British Empire concept to emphasize the British rather than distinctive English or Welsh pasts. Dee does not state the English and the Welsh came together to create a new identity. Instead, he asserts a restoration of ancient British identity over both. Dee did more than simply coin the phrase British Empire. He applied it to justify the meaning of Elizabethan expansion overseas. His mystical alchemical knowledge made him a trusted advisor to Elizabeth court with a substantial portion of her reign. This close personal connection allowed him to develop and present ideas to the Queen herself. Dee took the opportunity to build a body of ancient Welsh evidence for the Tudors' authority over the Americas. The historian Peter French argues that the Queen consulted Dee on the issue several times, specifically around her ancestral claims to overseas territory. The primary example that Dee used was Prince Madoc. The Lord Madoc, son to Owen Gwynedd, Prince of North Wales, led a colony and inhabited in Terra Florida or thereabouts. The statement served doubly to legitimize Tudor's claims to overseas territories. Firstly, the ancient settlers were already English subjects, separated by the ocean and lost to time. Secondly, it laid claim to the Spanish territory, Terra Florida. This specificity regarding land would give the Elizabethan government reason to try and seize land in the modern southern United States, then claimed by the Spanish state. This was to convince their English subjects and arm their ambassadors in Europe with just cause. As with earlier Tudor aims, the goal here is more than trying to convince the people of the rightness of their rule, it is also to legitimize their overseas claims to the rest of Europe. In this example, empire is both a constructive tool within England and a destructive one outside. If Spain were to wage war against Elizabeth's Welsh subjects in the Americas, any such actions overseas would be doomed defensive. When used by Dee, Prince Madoc turns the tools of Henry VII from regime formation and dynastic stability outwards to expansion. One of Dee's younger contemporaries, Richard Hackett, makes less grandiose claims about Prince Madoc, and draws extensively upon evidence in various chronicles. Sir Robert Cecil commissioned Hackett's account, which provides a history of English navigation. Hackett begins by citing Dr. David Powell as his chief source for the account of Madoc. He then connects the narrative to English claims in the Americas in opposition to Spanish power. He supplements the text in the margin to clarify his position. This land must be some part of that country of which the Spaniards affirmed themselves to be the first finders since Hannos' time. Whereupon it is manifest that the country was by Britons discovered long before Columbus led any Spaniards thither. Thus Hackett's claims of English authority are directed through the Welsh colony, though it remains unclear if he intends Britain to refer to the Kingdom of England, or is instead emphasizing that the Welsh are descended from the ancient British. In any case, he intended to legitimize claims to the Americas through an imagined sense of Britain. In Hackett's arguments, a historical possession of new lands is explicit, linking Elizabethan claims to the empire with ancient British precedent. There is one further detail that Hackett brings out, that of the state of the inhabitants of North American interior. He states, "Therefore it is to be supposed that he and his people inhabited part of these countries, for it appeareth by Francis Lopez de Gomara that Accusmil and other places were the honoured cross." Therefore, it is to be supposed that he and his people inhabited part of these countries, for it appeareth by Francis Lopez de Gomara that Accusmil and other places the people honour the cross. Whereby it may be gathered that Christians had been there before the coming of the Spaniards, but because his people were not many, they followed the manners of the land which they came unto, and used the language they found there. According to Hackett, the Welsh immigrants had come to a land integrated, at least partially, into indigenous cultures. Paradoxically, he discusses that they adopted the customs and language of those that they found there, complicating his insistence on the continent being empty. The passage affirms that the Welsh settlers integrated themselves into the environment they found there. It does not seem that Hackett is arguing that there was a hybrid culture, but rather the Welsh settlers adopted practices that allowed them to live in the Americas. His claims thus differ from Dee's, which focused on redefining and restoring an ancient nation. The distinction between Dee and Hackett's arguments is subtle, but illustrates both different purposes and different perspectives within the English court. In 1584, Dr. David Powell repeated the belief the Madoc journey centered around claiming the land from the Spanish in the 16th century. He restates that the land was empty upon Madoc's arrival. When he discusses Madoc's return to Gwynedd, Powell provides this sentiment. And after he had returned home and declared the pleasant and fruitful countries that he had found without inhabitant, and got with him such men and women as were desirous to live in quietness, and taking leave of his friends, took his journey thitherward again. To Powell, Dee, and Hackett, Maddox gave England a claim to the Americas in direct opposition to Spanish claims. The emptiness of the land before the Welsh provided cause for English exploitation. Their Welsh subjects were in two localities but under one kingdom. It might also imply that the English and the Welsh already considered the land in the Americas was not being used by its inhabitants. Powell, like his contemporaries, argued that Maddox was the first settler of North America, and that the peoples that now dwelled there were, by extension, his descendants. This antiquity of settlement also made them subjects of the Crown of England, and so construction of the Maddox myth expanded British jurisdictions across the Atlantic world. Powell, Hackett, and Dee had another contemporary, Humphrey Lloyd, like Powell and Dee, a Welshman, who discussed Maddox in his Chronica Walliae, in many ways echoing what scholars in the court had to say about the Maddox myth. Lloyd's primary purpose is to chronicle history. He states that the Britons were the first to the Americas. This land, to which Maddox came to, most needs be some part of Nova Hispania or Florida. Furthermore, he argues that Welshmen knew of the Americas before Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci, though his primary purpose is not to denounce Spanish claims. Instead, he emphasizes that Maddox was there first, clearly attempting to legitimate the kingdom's claims to these lands. The need to justify claims to the Americas first became both possible and necessary during the latter part of Elizabeth's reign, and authors framed this as a right built upon supposed ancient British migration. These writers emphasize reasons for expansion overseas and support the claims of the English crown over that of Spain. Tudor scholars' claims about the authenticity of Prince Maddox were maintained and perpetuated into the reigns of James VI and I. John Smith, governor of Virginia, wrote a history of Virginia in 1624, explaining how the Jacobean era understood the Maddox myth. Unlike the broader connection of the Tudor state to the British past, Maddox's legend maintained its utility into the reign of James VI. With Britain now transformed, at least in the eyes of the king and his supporters, into a realm embracing the entirety of the island, plus Ireland, and overseas territory. Though he only briefly accounts for this in his introduction, for which he draws on David Powell's work, Smith is far less confrontational than Elizabethan authors, reflecting the Jacobean regime's officially pacifist policy towards Spain. He acknowledges the claims of Spain that Hanno of Carthage discovered the Americas and the voyages of Maddox, but points out that nobody knows where Hanno landed. The conciliatory tone of the tale reflects Jacobean settlement of hostilities between Spain and England and the establishment of permanent English colonies in North America. He retold the story of Maddox, and it circulated within North American colonies. With permanent settlement now present in Virginia, it was no longer essential for Smith to proclaim Maddox's right to lands now under immediate control of the English colonists. Unlike in the 16th century accounts, there is no reference to prior formation of Welsh indigenous society. Instead, Smith describes indigenous people as thieves and pests in the new colony. As war with Spain became less of a threat to the kingdom, the story of Maddox in the early 17th century became a story which justified broader European claims to the Americas, rather than singularly the claims of the English crown. And if you have any questions or comments about any of the subjects that have come up in this here presentation, feel free to post them below. I would love to discuss this further. Just for a little bit of transparency and clarity, this paper is a section of my thesis, so if you want to read a lot more of the context behind what I'm arguing about with regards the Welsh connection to all things British by the 17th century, feel free to ask whenever you want. And have yourselves a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.